Hello everyone! Welcome to this channel. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in these stories. It was a late winter and we were slowly approaching spring. Life was going on as usual and we were a good family. Everything in our family was normal and we didn't have any significant problems. Financially, we were middle class, and my parents were very religious. Unlike me, who had little interest in religion and didn't take it too seriously. There were certain rituals and rules that only my mom followed strictly. My dad did some of them too, but I never cared much about religious beliefs, so I didn't follow the same path as my parents. They didn't pressure me either, allowing me to make my own choices. My dad was more focused on my mom and was particularly sensitive about religious boundaries between men and women. When I was younger, as a son of the family, the only thing that were drilled into me were about studying and religious beliefs. They somehow convinced me about the importance of studying, but when it came to religious beliefs, not so much. I thought differently from my parents and they didn't push me too hard. Their main belief was that I should be free to make my own decisions. However, they did have some strict rules, which I'll explain in more details as my story goes on. As far as I remember, my dad had a stable job for many years, but one day he came home really happy talking about a job change. The new job had a better income, but the downside was that he'd have to work longer hours and we might need to move. I had a lot of memories in the neighborhood we had lived in for years, and moving away from that place was hard for me. I couldn't see the friends I had made there in another place. Besides, we were closer to my grandparents, and because of my attachment to them, it was tough to be separated from them. Unfortunately, everything started to change after my dad's job switch. The day we moved because of his job, we ended up in a neighborhood that was more on scale and expensive compared to where we used to live. The only good thing was that we only had to pay rent with no upfront deposit required. The house was one of my dad's boss's properties, and since the job was government related, I can't discuss my dad's position. But the person who hired him was an important figure and gave my dad a high-ranking position due to his expertise and education, which totally changed our lives. We entered a new phase of life and my dad's salary increased significantly. But my family started to change a lot because of the money. Or maybe it wasn't just the money. It could have been the environment we were living in as well. The area was such that most people dressed casually, and my mom, who wore a chador, which was a traditional Islamic dress. On our first day of moving, our next door neighbor was a woman about the same age as my mom, and because they were close in age, they hit it off well. But she was the complete opposite of my mom. My mom was slim and wore simple clothes. But this woman wore bright colors and had tattoos on her arms. There was even a question mark tattooed on her cheek. She wore heavy makeup, had lip fillers, and her clothes were really short. She had a fit, athletic build but was still curvy. It means that she had a large frame with no extra fat, no belly, no love handles. If someone like us who hadn't seen many people like her before met her, her appearance might have seemed strange and misleading. Even I thought something else when I first saw her, and my mom tried to keep her distance. But when she came to help us move, our opinion of her started to change. She was kind and brought us fruit and tea while we were moving. I even thought she might be a bit spoiled, but she helped us and the workers unload the truck. That's how our first day with her went. Unlike my mom, she joked around a lot and was very relaxed. At first, she joked a lot with my dad, which irritated my mom. But over time, we realized she treated the workers the same way, so we didn't take it too seriously. A few days passed after we moved to the new neighborhood. My school had changed and I didn't have any new friends. The only good thing about the house was the wide street lined with trees on both sides. Because it was spring, the sound of birds and the smell of the leaves and grass made the place even more beautiful and pleasant. The way the street was landscaped made the new place feel less foreign. The apartment buildings stood next to each other, varying in height but perfectly organized. The building materials were the same, and this orderliness made me want to lie down in the middle of the street until the late at night and just stare at the sky. One day, like any other holiday, I went out to try and entertain myself alone. In our old neighborhood, whenever I went outside, there were always a few friends waiting to spend time together playing soccer. But the new neighborhood was different. Most of the time, no one was in the street except for me. The people who were around were either passing by, elderly or little kids much younger than me, so we didn't have much in common. That day I was walking around, checking out the buildings, when the door to our apartment opened and the same woman who helped us on first day came out. She was with a young man, holding his hand and laughing loudly at his jokes. He looked like he could be her son, or maybe a younger brother. In any case, I didn't interfere and kept walking. It was getting close to night when I decided to head back home. But before I reached our apartment building, I saw the same woman from a distance, this time with another young man, heading toward our building. I changed my direction so they could pass freely and also because I didn't want to make eye contact with her. I felt a bit embarrassed. After all, it was a new neighborhood. You might say the neighborhood is just a neighborhood, but for us it was different. The difference was that in our old place, if someone wore short clothes like this, they'd become the talk of the town. And if someone had heavy makeup, people would stare at them so intensely that they'd silently pray to get home quickly to escape their looks. But here it wasn't like that. It was the opposite. Sometimes I even thought people were staring at my clothes, and whenever I went out with my mom, I felt like people didn't find her traditional outfit very appealing. That night I saw the woman with another young man as they entered the apartment. For a moment, negative thoughts crossed my mind, but I quickly remembered her kindness and pushed those thoughts away before they could go any further. After they went inside, I slowly made my way home too. I still hadn't made any friends my age, so I spent most of my days alone. The only friends I had were my new classmates, who I had just met a few days ago. But our homes were far from each other, and I didn't have any friends living next door like before. A few more days passed after we moved to the new neighborhood. One day when I came home, I saw that same woman in our house, wearing a red tank top with her blonde hair down. The tank top revealed a tattoo on her chest, a heartbeat symbol with a small line of Greek text underneath. It was a delicate tattoo, but its length made it noticeable even from a distance. My mom was wearing her usual long, simple dress, looking quite different next to her. It surprised me that my mom had let this woman into our house since they were so different in every way and everything. But it seemed like my mom was happy with her presence and enjoyed talking to her. When my mom saw me, she glanced at the woman's tank top. I felt like she wanted to say something, but didn't. Instead, she just told me to go to my room. But the woman stopped her and said, "Come on, dear. Let the kid be here. I'm fine with that. There's no problem." She seemed to think my mom was asking me to leave because of her. In reality, my mom was concerned that seeing the woman in that state might not be good for me, as if it wasn't something our family culture was used to. I expected my mom to explain the real reason, but she didn't say anything, just smiled. I thanked them and walked past to go to my room, but before I got there, I heard her voice behind me saying, "Come back soon so I can get to know you more. Let's see if you're more like your mom or dad." When she mentioned my dad, I thought my mom would get upset and kick her out. But instead, I heard my mom laugh and jokingly say something back. I suddenly wanted to get to know this woman better and talk to her to understand what had brought her and my mom closer, and why my mom started to change a bit. That day, I gave up on trying to figure out my mom's reaction and joined them. I haven't even fully sat down when she asked, "Mehran, you're an only child, right?" She was very warm and friendly, and after chatting with her for a while, I found out she had two kids, a son and a daughter, and I was older than both of them. It was almost evening, and the woman was still at our house. My dad was about to come back home, and I thought if he saw her like this, my mom would definitely react. My dad arrived, and she still hadn't left. She didn't make any changes to her appearance, and my mom didn't confront her either, though her expression had changed. It was clear from my dad's cold and serious face that he wasn't too happy about her presence. The woman whose name I had just learned was Setare stayed at our house for dinner that night. When I sat next to her and looked closely at her face, I noticed that the hair on her chin was a bit thick. Even though she had shaved, a few thick hairs were still visible. A few days later, I couldn't go to school because of a bad cold. On that same day, Setare came to our house again, and by then, my mom had gotten used to her style. But that day, something changed in my mom. Setare suggested they go shopping together, and my mom agreed. When they returned, Setare wasn't with her, and my mom had a few new things she had bought for herself. From that day on, my mom started wearing new clothes, and her style changed. After Setare came into our lives, my mom changed even more. She stopped wearing her traditional chador, started wearing makeup more often, and her clothes became brighter and shorter. My dad didn't say anything, but these changes were very new for my mom. Sometime later, when I came home, I saw Setara with two new people. I guess they were her son and daughter. They looked a bit unusual. The one dressed in feminine clothes had a slightly masculine face, and the boy with her had a delicate face but a deep voice. Despite their ununique appearances, they seemed like good people. As time passed, their appearances became more typical, and they grew closer to their true genders. During this time, while we were neighbors, we became good friends. From her son Parviz, I found out that their father had left them a long time ago due to family issues, but he never told me the exact reason. The only one who didn't change was Sitare's daughter, Parastu. She remained quiet and reserved as always. Over time, she became more beautiful and feminine, which made me more attracted to her. Besides that, her quiet nature made me want to talk to her more to understand her better. Gradually, I started talking to Parastu more, and her quietness didn't bother me anymore. At first, it was difficult, but over time, I got used to it. Initially, she would respond to my calls occasionally, but gradually, she started answering every time. Sometimes she would even call me first, which gave me a lot of hope. In the end, I couldn't hold back my feelings any longer and confessed to her in a message, telling her everything I felt about her. Unfortunately, days went by and I didn't get a reply. She even stopped answering my calls. I realized I might have acted too soon. I should have been more patient and put in more effort. So I sent her another message saying, "Parastu, I'm so sorry. Let's forget about that. And just act like I never said anything." As soon as I sent this, Paris replied and said it would be better if we talked about it more. I thought she was really upset and wanted to express her feelings, but to my surprise, she responded positively and agreed to my request. That day, I found out that Paris had been interested in me for a long time, but hadn't said anything. One thing she said that was surprising was, "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll stay with me." I was so elated at that moment that I agreed to everything she wanted without really thinking about the strange things she was saying. After our relationship started, I tried to get closer to Parasu by becoming more friendly with her brother Parvis. If Parvis found out about our relationship, given our culture, he might have reacted poorly at first. But if I built a closer relationship with him, it would be easier to get closer to Parastu. A while into our relationship, I never considered asking for anything inappropriate from Parastu. But one day, Parvis happily showed me a picture on his phone and said, "Pretty, right?" I looked at the picture. It was of a girl wearing a white hat and she looked nice. Parvis said she was his new girlfriend, which was surprising. As we got more acquainted, I found out that Parvis was quite a flirt and was always with a new person. He talked about this girl and praised her a lot, even mentioning that he had several photos of her and that she was better in person than in pictures. This made me think about Parastu and why I hadn't even hugged her once. I started to worry that getting too close might upset her. I thought it would be better to ask for her permission or be indirect so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. One day, unlike our belief, when we were out, I tried to take her hand and pull her closer before she got into the car, but she quickly pulled away and pushed my hand back. I immediately apologized and she said, "Please, don't do that again." Her face was pale. I didn't understand why she was so defensive. It wasn't the first time she had reacted this way. I thought maybe something had happened to her in the past that made her react strongly to even a simple gesture. I talked to her seriously about it, and when we went out together, I told her I never meant to upset her and only wanted to experience things with her because I cared about her. But once again she frowned, crossed her arms and said, I don't want anything to happen between us before we're married, because I'm afraid you might regret being with me and leave me alone." I couldn't believe Paris was thinking about marriage with me. I genuinely loved her and didn't want to change her mind about marriage. It was the first time she mentioned this. I was very happy to hear her intentions and stayed silent. After that, I didn't make any physical moves towards her and didn't push for anything. If she wanted to wait until marriage, I was okay with that. My only concern was how to bring up my feelings for Paris with my family, and I was also unsure about Paris. Unfortunately, Parvis was kept talking about his new girlfriends and bragging about them. One day, I couldn't hold back and asked, "Have you actually done anything with them or just looked at their photos?" Parvis looked shocked and frowned. I was just joking, but it seemed I had upset him. I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Wait, don't tell me you're not packing anything down there." I expected him to laugh, but instead she frowned even more and stayed silent. To make him laugh, I reached out and touched him. His pants were thin fabric, and I was shocked by what I felt. My joke turned out to be true. Since it happened so quickly, Paris couldn't defend himself, and things escalated. I was just teasing him with a simple joke, but unfortunately it became serious. Paris suddenly punched me hard in the face. I tried to act like it didn't hurt and just apologized, pretending I didn't feel anything, but I was genuinely shocked by what I felt. I didn't know Paris was different, and it was so obvious that I didn't doubt what I had sensed. Sadly, I had messed up badly with that situation. I pushed Parvis away and he didn't come near me for a long time. I was really regretful about what I had done and tried everything to fix things and get back to how we were before. But sadly, I had already ruined it. As my relationship with Paris continued for a few years, I thought it was time to talk to my family about proposing. One night, when Setara and her children came over for dinner, Parvis didn't even look at me. That night, Setara asked my mom, "Don't you want to find a wife for your son?" Hearing this, I glanced at Parastu, who was frowning at the TV. My mom replied, "No, it's too early. Besides, he needs to make his own choice. I have nothing to do with it." This was the first time I had heard my mom say something like this. Considering her usual way of thinking, I expected her to say that Mehran should marry whoever I wanted. That's why I was uncertain whether to talk to her about Parastu or not. But that night, my mom indirectly assured me that I could discuss Parastu with her. A few days later, I let Parastu know that I wanted to talk to my family about her. I'll never forget the smile she had when she heard this. It was the first time I had seen such a beautiful expression on her face. Eventually, after a lot of inner struggle, I managed to talk to my family about Parastu and our years-long relationship. To my surprise, my parents were very happy, and my mom even said, "Who could be better than Parastu?" I was relieved that my mom and dad had no issues with Parastu being part of our family. Gradually, my mom also talked with Parastu's family, and with both families' approval, we went ahead with the proposal. Even during our engagement, Parastu wouldn't let me get close to her and was always worried that I might leave her. No matter how much I reassured her that I loved her and would never leave her, it didn't help, and she continued to distance herself. Since I was confident in my feelings for Parastu, when the topic of taste came up, I said in front of everyone, "I trust Parastu, no tastes are necessary." They were talking about a taste to determine if she had been with someone else before. My mom smiled at my comment, but Parastu turned red. I didn't understand why she was so stressed. At that moment, I was sure something had happened to her before, because a normal person wouldn't react that way. I wanted to know what had happened to her so I could help her move on. After all, whatever had happened wasn't her fault. If I hadn't asked for a test, she might have been more at ease and less worried. Our engagement period passed without us getting closer, and our wedding night arrived. Parastu was the only bride who wasn't happy on her wedding night and was just choking up. I didn't know why she was so stressed. Maybe it was because of what was supposed to happen between us. I couldn't hold back any longer. I needed to understand the reason for her state. After we got to our place and tried to get close to her, she was crying. The night was so bad, and that I told her I wouldn't come near her and just asked her not to cry. But Parastu kept trembling and said she was afraid I would dislike her. I couldn't control myself with her words and went to her to see what was going on. What I saw on her shocked me. It was exactly like her brother. She had both male and female characteristics, and unfortunately, we hadn't done any tests to figure this out earlier. She hadn't told me anything either. As I stared in shock, she cried and said, "Every time I wanted to tell you, you didn't accept it. You always thought there was another reason." She curled up and went to a corner, crying and trying to explain through sobs. She said, "The surgery was too expensive. We couldn't afford it at all. So I stayed this way. I wanted to tell you, but you kept avoiding it. I was so stressed. I couldn't tell you the truth until you saw it yourself tonight. My mind was only thinking about Paris. Both of them had issues and neither had talked about it. I was living with someone who was a woman but wasn't. I didn't know how to deal with this situation. If my family found out, they wouldn't react well. Paris seemed like a fragile girl, but I couldn't even see her as a girl anymore. I didn't know whether to see her as a boy or not. That night, Paris only talked and I listened. It was the first time I had faced something like this in my life. I couldn't hear any of her words. All I could think about was whether I really married someone like this. I couldn't believe it. I no longer understood Paris. I thought she had been touched inappropriately, but the reality was something else. She had unfortunately kept hidden from me. It was the worst night of my whole life. I was forced to continue my life with someone. I didn't like her situation. The next day, Paris came to me. She tried to talk to me, but I was inadvertently cold and unresponsive. Initially, I didn't even answer her questions. She'd ask about the food or the state of the house, but I had no real answers and just gave a vague nod or shake of my head. Eventually, she got frustrated and said, "Mehran, could you please not be so cruel? I'm saving up money for surgery to get better. I can't handle this." I looked at her and said, "What do you mean by getting better? Even if you do get better, it won't change anything between us. You kept this huge secret from me and now you act like it's nothing. Also, why haven't you had the surgery yet? It's been years. Now that you're in a shared life with me, you remember you need to save money." I didn't even realize my voice had risen. I felt justified. It was a huge shock for me. I couldn't see Paris as the delicate girl I used to. To me, she was now someone with both male and female characteristics, or the opposite. Her eyes welled up with tears from my words, but she still managed to hold herself together and said, "It wasn't under my control. Our financial situation isn't good enough to cover the costs. My mom couldn't provide the money. Now I'm using your money to save up." I couldn't believe it. She wanted to use my money for her treatment. It was a significant amount, and I hadn't anticipated such a heavy shoe being put on me. For a moment, it felt like she married me just to fix herself. Without thinking, I said, "With my money? What's next? Will I have to be your nurse too? And even you get the surgery, it won't change anything for me. How do I know you won't have another issue after the surgery that you haven't told me about?" She said nothing more. I had overstepped, but I wasn't aware of it at that moment. Her expression was one of helplessness, but I didn't regret my words. I was terminating her over this issue. My behavior had completely changed. I was finding fault with everything and causing her distress. I showed no respect for her, and Paris too, being silent, didn't say anything. I genuinely felt manipulated and used. Paris insisted she loved me, but I thought she was deceiving me just to find someone to marry her because in her situation no one would be willing. One day, when we were invited to a friend's wedding, she was excited and dressed up. But when I saw her, it reminded me of the worst night of all my life. I looked at her and said, "You're not coming. The dress will reveal everything and embarrass me." I ignored her pleas and didn't take her with me. At the event, I told others that my wife was ill and couldn't join me. I never took her anywhere with me and even slept on the couch to avoid being next to her. Time passed, and I realized I couldn't continue living like this. I needed someone with whom I could experience happiness, someone who could eventually give me children. Not Parastu, whom I didn't even dare to approach. I had made up my mind. I wanted to separate from her. Nothing mattered to me anymore. I just couldn't bear to see her. I had no feelings left for her. That night, when I returned home, I called her softly. I needed to speak calmly to reach a conclusion. When she sat in front of me, I said, "Look, Parastu, there is nothing significant between us, because I don't want to dare to be. Anyway, your surgery costs are substantial, and you haven't managed to cover them so far. I've told you several times that even if you do get the surgery, nothing will happen between us. So it's better to think logically and separate. I really don't have any feelings for you anymore." Her voice was trembling and she was crying. She kept mentioning her mother and said if she went back to her family, her mother wouldn't accept her. At that moment, I thought her mother had treated her well, and it was unlikely she'd act that way. It seemed like another of Parastu's attempts to manipulate me into not divorcing her, but I didn't change my mind. I want a separation. I had to tell my family about the situation to make the divorce process easier. When my mom found out, she screamed loudly and argued with me about why I hadn't told her sooner. I was scared to tell her because she might confront Setare. But thankfully, I managed to put all the blame on myself so that my family wouldn't get involved. The divorce process wasn't long, but the worst part was when Setare, smiling, came to the door and said that if I divorced her daughter, there would be no place for her in their home. I didn't take her seriously at first, but she said she couldn't tolerate the situation due to Parisu's issues and had already sent Paris to live with their grandmother. At that moment, I thought they were incredibly cruel. I hadn't heard from Paris for a long time, and I didn't know what was he doing. Anyway, it didn't matter to me anymore. I wanted a divorce, and that's what I got. We quickly finalized everything, and I was relieved to be done with Parastu. At first, Parastu kept coming to our door, wanting to come back, but I just turned her away and didn't even open the door. Her constant bothering got so bad that we had to move. We changed our place and moved a few streets down. We even had to move at night so Parastu wouldn't see us and bother us again. This was the first time I saw Parastu behaving like this. She was banging on the door, crying and begging me to come back. It was the first time I had been so indifferent to someone. Luckily, our move went smoothly without Parastu's interference. We lived in peace for a few months, but one day when I went outside, I saw Parastu right in front of me again. She was crying and begging me to come back because her mother wouldn't let her stay at home, and she really loved me. I'll never forget how I treated her like trash and pushed her to the side of the street. After that, I decided to leave the country. I got myself together and managed to migrate to Italy with a work visa. But my mom said Parastu still goes to our door place looking for me. To get rid of her, my mom told her about my move and she disappeared after that. At first days, being away from Parastu was fine and I was happy. But slowly, I started to miss her. However, I quickly snapped out of it and dismissed those silly thoughts. After all, Parastu and I weren't meant to be. And no matter how much I loved her, our relationship wasn't practical. In Italy, I married an Italian woman, and we had a child. Honestly, she was a bit cold and distant, and we couldn't really express our feelings for each other. Our relationship was very cold and boring. She didn't show much emotion, which I found unacceptable. One day, while I was out with my child, I was shocked to see Parastu laying on the street in a poor state. Her clothes were ragged. Her skin was dirty and blackened, and her hair was tangled. I couldn't believe how much she must have suffered to get here. I went up to her gently to make sure it was really her, and it was. As soon as she saw me, she burst into tears and threw herself into my arms. I tried to set aside my bad attitude. I took her to my home and introduced her to my wife as a cousin, so I could keep her there for a while. Seeing her up close made me realize how much I had missed her. Before talking to her, I gave her new clothes and sent her to the bathroom. I closed the door so she could be comfortable and not feel awkward. Almost an hour had passed since she went into the bathroom, and she still hadn't come out. I got worried and thought something might be wrong. I quickly went to the door and opened it forcefully, finding her just wrapping herself in a towel. She was shocked to see me and stared for a moment. I noticed that the extra things that used to be there was no longer present. She had finally had the surgery, but this time Parista looked really beautiful to me. I tried to push away what I had seen from my mind. When I talked to her about her migration, she said her mother had arranged the money for her to leave just to avoid seeing her, and she had gotten my address from my mother. My mom didn't think Paristu could make it all the way here and gave her the address. Paristu stayed with us for a few days, and I felt my feelings for her were coming back. In reality, my feeling hadn't changed. It was just the problem she had that had kept me from being with her. Eventually, I couldn't control myself and went to her. And I did what I should have done years ago. I felt like I was finally leaving. I didn't love anyone else but Parastu. It was there that I realized my feelings for her were real, and it was only the big secret that I couldn't handle. Now that she had the surgery and was fixed, I felt closer to her. Unfortunately, while we were in the middle of it, my wife opened the door and saw us in that state. It doesn't matter how much she yelled and made things worse for Parastu. I quickly divorced her and went back to living with Parastu. We had one other person with us, my son, and Parastu had no problem with him. From the start, Parastu was the only one who made me happy. But due to my short-sightedness, I couldn't keep her around for long. It took me a while to finally be with her, but I did. And we started a peaceful, uncomplicated life together.